Well, among the modern teaching modules that I use in the syllabus of teaching women and gender in world history is one on gender and health in Latin America. And it's a module that encourages students to think about health more broadly, not just sort of the absence of disease, but also um, mental health and kind of in general, what we would think of as kind of lifestyle issues. So the sources in the module include things related to what we think of as kind of women's health, um, but also sexuality and reproduction, things having to do with prostitution, domestic violence, birth control, abortion, and maternity leave. So again, women's health very broadly. And you could, depending on how you wanted to, where you're going with your class, what kind of class that you were teaching, you could look at this as an aspect of health. You could also use the unit and frame the unit kind of as reproduction, um, about domestic violence and about violence against women in general. The authors of the unit also encourage students to think about issues having to do with women of different social groups within Latin America. In other words, rich women and poor women, indigenous women and urban women, what we now today kind of in women's and gender studies call intersectionality. In other words, how different kinds of structures and hierarchies of oppression and power intersect with one another to shape people's experience. It's an old enough module that they don't use the word intersectionality, but students would understand that right away. When I'm teaching women and gender and world history, one of the things I often try to do for certain, as we kind of move into a more modern era, I try to, if the unit is looking at something from another part of the world, in other words, not from where they are, which is all of them in this, I try to have students make comparisons with, say, something that's going on. So, for example, when I teach this module as part of women's history, I make the focus not health necessarily, but sexuality and reproduction. So what I have the students do, they're using online resources here with World History Commons. So what I say is, okay, well, let's try to figure out, let's try to make some comparisons with the Latin American material that's from the late 20th century and early 20 in here, and sort of what's going on today. And I'll just predict that in the future, because I've been teaching for 40 years, there has never, ever, ever been a time when sexuality and reproduction are not in the news. I mean, never. And there never will be going forward in the future. So whatever's happening as we think about what's going to happen with abortion in this country, or with other issues having to do with reproductive rights, or with violence, or with sexuality, that having students then be able to take the sources that are in the unit and the issues that are brought up in the sources of the unit, is something that, and then kind of compare them with what's going on today. So, for example, one of the sources in that unit is about maternity leave and what are maternity leave policies in various kinds of places, including Cuba. So I say to my students, well, what's the maternity leave policy of the United States? And most of them actually don't know that we don't have one. They're like, we're the only country in the entire industrialized world that doesn't have mandated maternity leave. So that we have a worse maternity leave policy than Cuba, which surprises them. It's also sort of sometimes fun to say, okay, like look it up. And that means that students can take out their cell phones, which they already have out in class, and you're telling them to use their cell phone to look something up, which they always think of as fun. The materials that are there, that are historical, they really offer really excellent opportunities for making comparisons with whatever happens to be going on right now in the community in which your students, wherever you happen to be teaching, in which your students are embedded. I think sometimes that's also a good thing to do, is to say, okay, well, world history, sometimes we think of it as giant movements of peoples and these giant patterns of things like that, but to try to simply say, well, you're part of world history too. You sitting in my classroom are part of world history. And how is what's going on generally globally, what is the impact that it has directly here, wherever you happen to be sitting? And also then what's the role of whatever is going on in your place? How does that contribute to whatever larger trends you find reflected in the kind of materials that you're using here?